In 1700, India produced nearly 25% of the world's economic output. It was the wealthiest region on Earth, richer than all of Europe combined. By 1950, when Britain finally left, India's share of global GDP had collapsed to less than 4%. 200 million people lived in absolute poverty. Famines had killed tens of millions. A once prosperous civilization had been systematically impoverished. What happened in those 250 years? According to economist Utsa Patnaik's research, Britain extracted approximately $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938, adjusted for inflation. Not through normal trade, not through fair exchange, but through a sophisticated system of economic exploitation that made colonial theft look like legitimate commerce. This wasn't accidental poverty. It wasn't the natural result of backward economies meeting modern ones. It was engineered extraction, a deliberate transfer of wealth from India to Britain that funded the Industrial Revolution, built British global dominance, and created the modern world economy. But here's the question that still divides historians. Was this systematic theft, or was it simply how empires worked? And if it was theft, can it ever be repaid? This is the story of how Britain took $45 trillion from India and left poverty in its place. To understand how Britain extracted $45 trillion, you need to understand how they conquered India in the first place. Because Britain didn't conquer India, a private company did. The East India Company was founded in 1600 as a trading corporation. Its mission was simple: buy Indian textiles, spices, and goods to sell in Europe. It had shareholders. It paid dividends. It was a business. But by 1765, this business had become the ruler of Bengal, the richest region in India, with a population larger than Britain itself. How does a company conquer a subcontinent? The answer lies in the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Robert Clive, a company military officer, defeated the Nawab of Bengal through a combination of superior tactics and massive bribery. He paid off the Nawab's generals to switch sides mid-battle. The victory gave the East India Company control over Bengal's revenue system. And in 1765, the Mughal emperor, still the nominal ruler of India, granted the company the Diwani, the right to collect taxes. This was the turning point. The East India Company was now both merchant and government. It could tax India's wealthiest region and use that revenue to fund further conquest. Within 50 years, the company controlled most of the Indian subcontinent. Not for Britain, for a corporation. And the first thing this corporation did was restructure India's economy to serve British interests. Before British rule, India's agricultural system had evolved over centuries. Farmers paid taxes, but the rates were flexible, adjusted for droughts, floods, and harvest quality. During bad years, taxes were reduced or forgiven. The British system was different. In 1793, Lord Cornwallis, yes, the same general who lost at Yorktown, introduced the permanent settlement in Bengal. Land revenue was fixed at an extremely high rate and had to be paid in cash, regardless of harvest quality. This created immediate problems. Indian farmers traditionally operated in a mixed economy, growing food for subsistence and selling surplus. But under the new system, they had to grow cash crops to pay taxes. Rice paddies were converted to indigo plantations. Food security collapsed. Worse, the revenue demand was calculated based on peak harvest years. During droughts or floods, farmers still had to pay the same amount. If they couldn't pay, their land was seized and auctioned. This created a new class of absentee landlords, often British officials or Indian collaborators, who bought up land at auctions and squeezed even more revenue from peasant farmers. The result? Persistent rural poverty and recurring famines. But here's the crucial detail. Where did the tax revenue go? Not into Indian infrastructure, not into irrigation or roads or education. The revenue was transferred to Britain, used to pay dividends to East India Company shareholders, fund British military campaigns, and finance Britain's growing global empire. Between 1765 and 1938, an estimated $45 trillion in wealth, measured in today's money, was extracted through this system. To put that in perspective, $45 trillion is more than 15 times Britain's current GDP. It's roughly equivalent to the entire economic output of the United States for 3 years. This wasn't taxation, it was systematic extraction. But the land revenue system was only part of the story. The second mechanism of extraction was deindustrialization, the deliberate destruction of India's manufacturing base. In 1700, India produced roughly 25% of the world's textiles. Indian cotton cloth was the most sought-after fabric on earth. European merchants couldn't compete with Indian quality or price, so Britain changed the rules. Starting in the late 1700s, Britain imposed tariffs on Indian textiles entering Britain, sometimes as high as 70 to 80%. Meanwhile, British manufactured cloth could enter India with minimal tariffs or none at all. Indian weavers couldn't compete. Their markets collapsed. But it gets worse. The British actively destroyed India's textile industry. In some regions, company officials cut off the thumbs of skilled weavers to prevent them from working. This isn't metaphor. There are documented cases of this brutality. Why? Because Britain needed India as a captive market for British textiles, not as a competitor. The city of Dhaka in Bengal was once called the Manchester of the East, a textile manufacturing hub employing hundreds of thousands of weavers. By 1840, its population had collapsed by 2/3. The industry was dead. Meanwhile, Manchester, the actual Manchester, was booming. British textile mills, powered by steam engines and protected by tariffs, flooded India with cheap cloth. The raw cotton was often grown in India, shipped to Britain, manufactured into cloth, and sold back to Indians at inflated prices. India became a source of raw materials and a captive market, classic colonial economics. This process is called deindustrialization, and its effects were catastrophic. Millions of Indian artisans lost their livelihoods. India's share of global industrial output collapsed from 23% in 1800 to less than 2% by 1900. And where did the profits go? To British industrialists, British workers, and British economic development. India's loss was Britain's gain, directly, measurably. But the most insidious mechanism of extraction was something called home charges. Here's how it worked. Britain governed India, which meant British administrators, soldiers, and infrastructure were paid for by Indian taxes. Fair enough. Colonized people paying for their own oppression is standard imperial practice. But Britain went further. Every year, India was charged for the salaries of British officials governing India, paid in pounds, not rupees. The cost of British military campaigns outside India, including wars in Afghanistan, China, and even Britain's own wars in Europe. The pensions of retired British officials, paid decades after they'd left India. The cost of building British infrastructure in London, including the India Office Building. These charges were calculated in pounds sterling and had to be paid by India in hard currency or gold. This created a permanent drain. India had to export more than it imported, not to build trade surpluses for Indian development, but to generate the foreign currency needed to pay Britain. The economist Dadabhai Naoroji called this the drain of wealth. In his 1901 book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, he calculated that Britain was extracting between 30 to 40 million pounds per year, equivalent to hundreds of billions today. And here's the kicker. These payments were recorded as debt service in British accounts. India wasn't being robbed. It was in debt to Britain for governing itself with its own tax revenue. This continued for nearly 2 centuries. The clearest proof that this system was broken? The famines. Between 1765 and 1947, India experienced more than 24 major famines that killed an estimated 30 to 60 million people. Before British rule, famines occurred, but they were localized and managed through traditional relief systems. Mughal emperors would open grain stores, suspend taxes, organize food distribution. Under British rule, famine became systematic. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 killed 10 million people, 1/3 of Bengal's population. It happened just 5 years after the East India Company took control of tax collection. Why? Because during the famine, the company continued to collect full land revenue. Farmers who couldn't pay had their food stocks seized and sold to meet revenue targets. People starved while grain was exported. This pattern repeated throughout British rule. The Madras Famine of 1877, the Indian Famine of 1899 to 1900, and most notoriously, the Bengal Famine of 1943, which killed 3 million people. During the 1943 famine, Winston Churchill's government continued to export food from India, while Bengalis starved. When officials begged for emergency food shipments, Churchill allegedly said it was Indians' fault for breeding like rabbits. Whether he said those exact words is debated. What's not debated, Britain prioritized feeding British and Allied troops over preventing an entirely preventable famine. This wasn't natural disaster. It was policy failure, enabled by an economic system that valued extraction over human life. So how do we get to $45 trillion? Economist Utsa Patnaik calculated this figure by tracking the unrequited exports from India between 1765 and 1938, goods and services that left India without equivalent payment. Here's the method. Every year, India exported more than it imported, creating what should have been a trade surplus. But that surplus didn't stay in India. It was transferred to Britain through land revenue sent to London, home charges paid in sterling, profits repatriated to British shareholders, salaries and pensions paid to British officials. Patnaik calculated the total value of these transfers, adjusted for inflation and compound interest, and arrived at approximately $45 trillion. Other economists dispute the exact figure. Some say it's lower, maybe $20 to $30 trillion. Others argue methodology problems with calculating historical GDP in pre-industrial economies. But even the conservative estimates show trillions of dollars in wealth transfer. And here's what's undisputed. During British rule, India went from producing 25% of global GDP to less than 4%. Britain went from a marginal European power to the world's dominant empire. The correlation is hard to ignore. But let's address the counterargument, because this is where the debate gets contentious. Some historians argue, 1. Britain also invested in India. Railways, telegraphs, irrigation. True. But the railways were built primarily to extract resources and move troops, not to develop India. The railway system was designed to ship raw materials to ports for export. Moreover, India paid for all of it through taxes. Britain didn't invest its own money. It used Indian revenue to build infrastructure that served British interests. 2. India benefited from modern governance and rule of law. India had sophisticated governance systems for thousands of years before British arrival. From the Mauryan Empire to the Mughals, British rule of law primarily protected British property and commercial interests. And if modern governance was such a gift, why did 60% of Indians remain illiterate when Britain left in 1947? Why was life expectancy only 32 years? 3. You can't judge historical empires by modern standards. This is true. All empires extracted wealth, but we can still measure the impact. And the data shows that India's relative poverty increased under British rule compared to earlier periods. 4. India's poverty was caused by overpopulation and backwardness, not British rule. India's population grew during British rule. True, but so did its agricultural output, which was exported. Poverty wasn't caused by lack of resources, but by extraction of those resources. The counter-arguments don't erase the fundamental reality. Wealth flowed from India to Britain for 200 years, and India became poorer while Britain became richer. So, what do we do with this history? Should Britain pay reparations? If so, how much? $45 trillion is more than any country could ever repay. Some argue that reparations are impossible. The people who committed these acts are dead, and modern British citizens shouldn't be held responsible for colonial crimes. Others argue that Britain's current wealth is built on colonial extraction, and therefore Britain owes a debt to former colonies, regardless of who currently lives there. The debate is complex, but here's what's clear. The economic systems established during colonial rule didn't disappear when Britain left. The poverty, underdevelopment, and inequality created by 200 years of extraction still shape India today. And Britain's prosperity, its museums full of stolen artifacts, its financial sector built on colonial-era capital, its global influence rooted in empire, that didn't disappear either. History isn't morally neutral, and understanding this history changes how we see the modern world. When we talk about developed and developing nations, we're using language that obscures the truth. Some nations developed because others were underdeveloped. Britain's rise and India's decline were two sides of the same coin. Today, India is the world's 5th largest economy, projected to become the 3rd largest within years. The British Empire is gone. The economic relationship has reversed. But the scars remain. India's poverty rate has dropped dramatically since independence, but it took 75 years to recover from what was done in 200. Millions still live in conditions created by colonial underdevelopment. And in Britain, this history is barely taught. Most British people have no idea that their country's prosperity was built partially on systematic extraction from India. That's changing. Movements demanding acknowledgement, if not reparations, are growing. The conversation is shifting from, did Britain benefit from empire? Obviously yes. To what moral obligations does that create? There's no easy answer. You can't undo 200 years of extraction with a check. Reparations can't resurrect the millions who died in famines. Money can't restore lost industries or vanished cultures. But acknowledgement matters. Truth matters. Understanding that poverty isn't natural, that it's often engineered, that matters because the story we tell about history shapes the world we build for the future. And the story of British India isn't about backward societies being civilized by advanced ones. It's about the systematic transfer of wealth from the many to the few, about how empire really worked. $45 trillion, that's the price of progress. Someone else's progress, paid for with someone else's poverty. And that's a bill that's never been settled. If this deep dive into colonial economics challenged what you thought you knew about the British Empire, you're not alone. The mechanisms of empire, the boring parts, the economic systems, the financial extraction, those are the parts history class skips, but they're the parts that matter most. Here at Imperial Echoes, we dig into the economics of empires, the real cost of conquest, and the historical debts that still shape our world. From Rome to Britain to America's informal empire, we follow the money, because that's where the truth is. Hit subscribe for more documentaries on how empires actually worked, not how they said they worked. We've got videos coming on the economics of slavery, the real cost of colonialism in Africa, and whether reparations could ever actually work. Drop a comment. Do you think Britain owes reparations to India? Is $45 trillion even calculable? Or is trying to assign blame for historical crimes fundamentally misguided? And if you want to understand how global inequality was created, not by accident, but by design, check out our other videos on colonial extraction and the economics of empire. Because the world we live in was built by the past, and understanding that past is the first step to building a different future. Thanks for watching. History remembers the empires that rose. We remember what they cost.